All right, I'm sorry to move us on, but on the other hand, I'm not sorry. So, let's just keep running that race. So here we are. Woohoo! We've made it to the last panel. Yeah. Congratulations. I want to give you the key word right up front. The key word is marital chastity. Marital chastity. Again, I find for a lot of people, marital chastity is like an oxymoron. Like when they hear that for the first time, they're like, they don't see how marriage and chastity go together. Because what are they thinking when they hear chastity? Yeah, they're thinking permanent abstinence. So, sometimes I joke, when I'm speaking to married couples and I introduce that phrase, I say, have you ever seen Curious George? Okay, so I put up a picture of Curious George. And I said, I'm just curious. How many of you married couples got married so you could permanently abstain from sex the rest of your life? And they laugh, right? Because of course not. Nobody gets married so they can permanently abstain. As a matter of fact, it's like the opposite. And so it's my point of saying it can't mean that. That's not what marital chastity means. So in this panel, John Paul II wants to accomplish many things. Take the adequate anthropology, which we know is what kind of an anthropology?
Robust Trinitarian anthropology.
Exactly. So he wants to take the robust Trinitarian anthropology of the human person he's been describing in Theology of the Body and apply it to marital and family chastity, marital family morality. He wants to look again at the significance or the significance, again the sign value of marital union. So he introduces it. So I've developed it much more than what he does in Theology of the Body. And again, I pulled out a very particular dimension for you. I don't usually, my presentation for the 5th panel on language of the body is usually very different. I organize it around what's called the divine pedagogy. The fact that God communicates to us through words and deeds. It's very, very helpful. But I really wanted for you, I wanted to bring out this liturgical dimension. So he introduces this idea of looking at the marital union in panel 5, but he's going to come back to it. He wants to demonstrate that the moral norms of Humanae Vitae are not imposed from the outside, right? Because isn't that the claim? Isn't that the accusation? How dare the church impose her morality on me? So he wants to say, no, it's not imposed from the outside, but it's the natural expression of living the language of the body. It's our ontology. The church, like the 10 Commandments, simply help us know how to be human, how to live in a human way. He wants to identify the essential difference between contraception and periodic abstinence. So I might skip around a little bit here because I want to make sure we get to this point. Because this is a really important and burning question. What's the difference between using contraception and NFP? Because really, from the outside, they look the same. Because the end goal is the same. You're trying to avoid conception. So what's the difference? And it can be kind of hard to answer this question. And then he wants to look on one of my favorites, the fruits of periodic abstinence. I often say, okay, we need to have a conference, right? Come, we're having a conference on the fruits of periodic abstinence. Come one and all, come one and all. Right, who's going to show up? Maybe 3 people. But they need to. Because periodic abstinence in marriage, again, is not supposed to be like this heavy cross that I carry to show God how much I'm sacrificing for Him. Intrinsic to periodic abstinence are fruits of the human person, of maturing in our humanity. But it's rarely ever spoken about. So this section, it's pretty long and it's pretty content heavy, so I just want to apologize at the beginning. I want to take us through a very, very brief 20th century history of contraceptive beliefs. It's very important to remind ourselves and our culture that for 1900 years, all Christian traditions, and even many non-Christian traditions, believed interfering with conception was a grave sin. Universal. For 1900 years. And then the Lambeth Conference, which is the Church of England in 1930, changed at all. So in the back, I have given you the resolution in your appendix in the back. I've given you the resolution from the 1930 Lambeth Conference because it's fascinating to see how it's worded. I also gave you the 1920 Lambeth Conference resolution that still embraced abstinence only as the only means of spacing family. So you could see what happened, the change in language from 1920 to 1930. So in that year, the Church of England declared birth control was acceptable, and this is important, only within marriage and only for grave reasons. They're very clear, but I mean, come on, given human nature, only within marriage and only for grave reasons. Okay, that didn't last for very long. And it still recognized that it specifically says abstinence is the preferred means of spacing children. But there was this little opening, right? It's like these little windows up here. It's like there was a little opening in the window and eventually pushed wide open so that it resulted in all mainline churches changing their teaching, except the Catholic Church. Again, I choose my language very carefully because I've heard people say all Christian churches believe in birth control. It's only the Catholic Church that continues her teaching against it, and that's not true. The Amish still believe that using birth control is intrinsically evil. The Mennonites. So there are some segments within Christianity. So if you're going to make a sweeping statement, please be sure to say all mainline churches change their teaching. In response to the Lambeth Conference, Pius XI, God bless him. Oh, I can't wait to meet him in heaven, God willing. He wrote Casti Connubii. So notice there's two I's at the end, Connubii. The English title is on Christian marriage, and he released it December 31st, 1930, right? Got it right in there under the line. So he's responding. It's a beautiful development of the Church's articulation of marriage and marital love in itself as ordered toward the perfection of the spouses. So as far as I know, this is the first time this language enters official church teaching. Here's what he wrote. The outward expression of love in the home demands not only mutual help, but must go further, because that was 1917 code, talks about one of the ends of marriage is mutual help. That must have as its primary purpose that man and wife help each other day by day in forming and perfecting themselves in the interior life. Wow. Again, do you think most married couples think that one of the primary responsibilities of marriage is to help to perfect each other in their interior life? It's beautiful. He restates the Catholic Church's constant teaching on procreative love. So at the bottom of the page, he says, since therefore the conjugal act is destined primarily by nature for the begetting of children, those who in exercising it deliberately frustrate its natural power and purpose to do what? To bring forth children, right? To procreate. Sin against nature and commit a deed which is shameful and intrinsically vicious. Please tell me, when was the last time you heard a homily on using contraception is intrinsically vicious? Is not going to. Did they use the word intrinsically vicious, Patrick? But vicious here is used as an expression of vice. In other words, it's the opposite of virtue. That's what he's saying. It's not like a vicious dog, mean, ready to bite you and give you rabies, although it's very harmful. It means it's the opposite of virtue. So that when you're using contraception, you're engaging in a vice. If you turn the page, then he says very clearly, I don't know if you're aware, but in a church document, when a pope teaches on faith and morals, because that's the only time a pope is infallible, is when he teaches on faith and morals, and he's teaching it in a document, he, I think, almost always speaks in the plural. Our. So that should be a hint to you when you're reading a document that something important is being said. Our mouth proclaims anew any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature. And those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin. Is it clear? Yes, very clear, isn't it? It's very clear. Clear, constant teaching of the church. So what year was this? 1930. Then we have research in the development of the birth control pill that's occurring in the 1950s. And if I remember correctly, it comes onto the market in 1960. This proposed a difficult problem, which is that is the birth control pill morally permissible? Because in one sense, it seems more natural. It's like taking an aspirin. You just take the pill and your headache goes away. Well, you take the birth control pill and somehow it works in your body so that, you don't have to worry about conceiving. So do you see, it wasn't immediately obvious that the birth control pill, whether it was morally permissible or not, because it's obvious how a condom interferes with a natural act of intercourse. It's obvious how withdrawal interferes, right? So it's obvious how those other mechanisms work. But the birth control pill appears more natural because it looks like you enter into a natural act of intercourse. So this is really hard to try to understand. Do you know, I don't want to get far afield, but we have a similar problem at the moment. It's all of the frozen embryos that are in cryopreservation. We don't yet have a clear moral teaching on what to do with them. It's very divided. You can argue both ways. What do I mean? You can argue that they're being preserved through extraordinary means, so that it's morally permissible to turn off the cryopreservation and allow them to die a natural death. That's hard, isn't it? But one can argue that. Or the other argument is that, no, it's human life. The baby needs to be implanted in a woman's womb and brought to the fullness of life. I mean, that seems very obvious, but other people argue, but that's unnatural. That's against the natural law. So you could see we are really divided. And there is no clear teaching at the moment on it. It's tough. So you can see sometimes we face new moral problems where the answer is not immediately obvious. So Vatican II meets from 1962 to 1965, smack in the middle of this problem about the birth control pill. And Gaudium et Spes numbers 47 to 52. By the way, Gaudium et Spes should be part of your, definitely part of your bookshelf. But numbers 1 to 52, just critical reading. Because again, in the early 60s, their analysis of the modern world, their analysis of atheism is amazing. So it's very important that we understand it and teach from it. And for our lay people to understand, look, the church is not backwards. Look at what she was already understanding in the early 60s. So Gaudium et Spes continued a development of an understanding of marriage and marital love as covenantal and personal. Would you please circle those words? Because this is what's new. This is what Casti Connubii began to introduce this more personal language. Right? In another part, I didn't quote it, but it talks about this friendship between a husband and wife. So it's very different kind of language than the juridical language of the 1917 code that here are the ends of marriage. It doesn't really talk about the person or about conjugal love. And so you can see this development of doctrine. So its marital love is covenantal and personal, and it provided guidelines on the transmission of human life. Like, what principles do we take into account? And it reiterated the moral necessity of conjugal chastity, of abstinence, but it didn't specifically tackle the question of the pill. So what ended up happening is John the 23rd created a separate commission. It has a very long name, but we all just now we all refer to it as the Birth Control Commission. So he took it out of the deliberations of the council and gave it to this commission. Anyone know who was one person on that commission eventually? Carol Wotea, the future John Paul II. God, it says 48. So listen to the personalistic language. The intimate partnership of married life and love, this is where we get the pairing of those two words, life and love, has been established by the Creator and qualified by His laws and is rooted in the conjugal covenant of irrevocable personal consent. Isn't it beautiful? By their very nature, the institution of matrimony and conjugal love are ordered for the procreation and education of children and find in them their ultimate crown. So a very subtle but important shift here is, notice it doesn't say the conjugal act. What does it say? Conjugal love. You see, it's shifting the focus from the act itself apart from the person. The focus is being shifted to what is marriage and what is marital love. Because after all, the act is being performed by persons in this covenant of marital love. And the act is an expression of marital love. So if we understand the human person and marital love, we will understand more deeply the conjugal act. Are you following that shift? It's very, very important. Would you nod your head if you're following that shift? Thank you so much. I didn't ask you to jiggle. You didn't follow it. Okay, great, Lucas. Okay, so the 1917 Code speaks only about the act. Let's see. It would be as if I talked about the act of shooting a goal in hockey. And I only talked about what's the end of that act. What is it? Getting it in the net. And I didn't speak anything about the context of it. You have no idea where this act happens. Does it happen in the grocery store? Right? Does it happen on the baseball field? Thank you. So I'm glad you asked me to clarify it. Right? So it didn't speak about the broader context, because that's what helps to morally qualify the act. You have to know who's doing the act and in what setting is it. So who are the spouses, and the setting is conjugal love. Is that clear? Thank you, Lucas, so much. In God says 50, I just want to note that it highlights the fact that husband and wife are cooperators with the love of God, the Creator. So this is where we get the idea of being co-creators, co-cooperators with God. But you know what? We're co-cooperators with God all the time. Right? We're co-laborers in the vineyard. So it's, again, we have to understand marriage, marital love, and the conjugal act in the broader context of discipleship with Jesus Christ. In the broader context of the call to holiness, right? Holy matrimony. That in everything we're meant to be co-laborers with God. I like to say we co-art with God, right? That we join Him in creating this artistry that's all around us. It's not a real word, but okay. I put here, it says 50, because if you lose your workbook, make sure that you have taken a photo of this or written it somewhere so you have it. Because this is where you can direct people into what are the principles that the church gives a married couple. So look at the line just above where it says, this means they will make decisions by common counsel and effort. Okay, so what should inform their decision? Here we go. God says 50 gives us a very helpful framework. Let them, meaning husband and wife, thoughtfully take into account their own welfare and that of their children. So they need to look at their own lives. They need to look at the situation of their children. Their children already born and those which the future may bring. For me, one of the most graphic examples of this for me were friends of mine who didn't know it, but they both had a recessive gene that resulted in their children being born blind. And so after they had 2 children, they really felt that, that they needed to pour themselves in and be available to their 2 blind children, and so they practiced permanent abstinence. They practiced, not permanent abstinence, they practiced periodic abstinence, natural family planning, because they were taking into account the welfare of their children already born and what that demanded of them. So those already born and those which the future may bring. For this accounting, they need to reckon with both the material and spiritual condition of the times, as well as their state in life. What if you're in the midst of war? Is that a good time to ask God to send you a wee person? It's probably not the best timing. So it would be a very appropriate time to postpone having children, to be abstaining during the time, the fertile time, because that's what natural family planning does, is it learns to read the signs. There are signs in a woman's body, biological signs that change as she goes through her menstrual cycle, because as her hormones change, things in her body change. So she can learn to read those change of signs and know when she's fertile. What is a man's rhythm of being fertile? Like, a woman is really fertile, actually fertile, only about 3 days of her cycle, because an egg only lives 24 hours. And so if she double ovulates, means releases 2 eggs, okay, it's possible she could be fertile, meaning able to conceive, like 2 days of her cycle. How many days of her cycle is the man fertile?
Every day.
Every day, like 24/7. So that's why, we talk about the woman's fertility, but it's really couple fertility, right? It's marital fertility. Because it takes 2 to tango, it takes 2, right? To bring a wee person into existence. Anyway, so reading a woman's sign, okay, we need to be abstaining during this fertile window of time, which actually ends up being about 7 to 10 days. It's amazing. If you don't know how it works, ask, Father Abbot or Father Prior to have someone, or find a little video where you can watch about feminine fertility. Actually, one time I gave a talk to seminarians exactly on that, because they had no idea how it worked. And it's understandable. You're not women. Okay, so the material, yes, Lucas.
Question, just about the clarification on the accounting for both the material and spiritual conditions. So the material, just I think that's kind of obvious.
You're in debt. Yeah, you're in poverty, or let's say you have 6 kids, right? Your material resources, they're maxed out.
So then,
or even, you could even with 3 kids.
Right. And then what would constitute, say, like
the spiritual condition? What if the church is under persecution?
Right, okay. Yeah.
So again, I try to make this concrete of thinking different situations around the world. One would be war, but China.
Right.
China had its 1-child policy, for decades. Now you can have 2 children. But I always say everybody in China needs to know natural family planning.
Yeah.
Because it was true. If you had conceived a 2nd child, you were forcibly aborted. There are stories. They are horror stories of women being dragged out of their homes and being subjected to a forced abortion because it was a 2nd child. Right? I often think of, the countries under communist rule. How difficult it would be during those times. So that would be an example. Thank you. Finally, they should consult the interests of the family group, of temporal society, and of the church itself. So you can see, this is why this really kind of needs to be in your back pocket or in your phone, or wherever you can, make reference to it. Because, again, most Catholics don't have any idea. They've never read Gaudium et Spes, and they don't know Gaudium et Spes 50. So it provides these principles. Number 51. Now he's going to give us a little morality lesson. Hence, when there is a question of harmonizing conjugal love with the responsible transmission of life, the moral aspects of any procedure do not depend solely on sincere intentions or on an evaluation of motives, but must be determined by objective standards. So as I said, this is a basic morality lesson, and from it we can kind of diagram out a little bit of what we're experiencing now of morality versus true morality versus moral relativism. So notice what Gadamer says is saying is that the morality of an act is not determined by sincere intentions alone. Right? This is what our culture tries to baptize their action by saying, my intentions were good. I love this person, or, I wanted, the best for this. So it doesn't matter what the means are as long as my intention is good. So that's not the way God's design nor church teaching understands the morality of an act. In contrast, moral relativism says, I give moral value to my actions. In other words, I define what's right and wrong according to how it benefits me, according to how it brings me happiness. That's all that matters, and is how I feel, and that I feel intensely this way, and that must make it right. There's so much in this. All right, I want to share with you what I call my moral multiplication, morality multiplication. So we're going to look at a way of looking at this using multiplication. So morality multiplication. Just as a way as a way of diagramming it out. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but especially like starting in high school, I find this helpful. Okay, so we're going to, it is motive, in other words, my intention, times my means, my chosen action, equals the morality of something. Okay, and we're going to use ones and zeros. Ones means it's good, 0 means it's not good. Okay, I have a good motive. I love my boyfriend. Is that a 1 or a 0? 1. Right, it's a 1. I have a bad means. I sleep with him. Is that a 1 or a 0? It's a 0. What does that equal?
0.
A 0. I have a bad motive. I want to trap my boyfriend into marrying me. Is that a 1 or a 0? It's a 0. I have a good means. I make him delicious meals. Is that a 1 or a 0? It's a 2.
That's still a 0.
No, it's a 1. It's a good means. Right? There's nothing immoral about making good meals unless I've stolen the ingredients, right? Is that a 1 or a 0? That's a 0. I have a bad motive. I want to trap my boyfriend into marrying me. Is that a 1 or a 0? 0. I have a bad means. I sleep with him. Is that a 1 or a 0? 0. What does that equal? Yeah, definitely a 0. I have a good motive. I love my boyfriend. 1 or a 0? 1. I have a good means. I make him adobo every day. No, I make him delicious meals every day. Is that a 1 or a 0? It's a 1. What does that equal? In all of these situations, which one alone is a moral act? All right, the last one. So we must have a good motive and a good means. But which one of these does our culture want to say, oh no, this is a good act, good moral act? Which one of the ones that is not does our culture want to say it is? Right, this one. Right, our culture wants to say, as long as I have a good motive. We see this dramatically in vitro fertilization. What's the motive? New life, right? A baby. Wow! I mean, that's a good motive. But what's the problem? It's a very harmful means. So this can help you help other people understand that this is the only morally good act. That it must be. So, but this brings up, we're going to see it in a bit, but since we're up here, I'll show you. So can you give me, let's see. Yeah, John Paul II is going to note that natural family planning can be used in this way. Natural family planning, it's a good means, but it can be used with a bad motive. So just because we're using a good means, that also doesn't baptize the act. We have to have a good motive as well. All right, so that's kind of the little simple morality lesson that Gaudium et Spes is trying to give us, that it doesn't depend. Yes, what? Joshua?
Well, I've thought about this before as well, like NFP being good means, but a bad motive. I'm trying to pinpoint when the actual wrong act is. Is the wrong act in abstaining, or is the wrong?
The wrong act. Okay, so I'll give you an example. People get married, they don't ever want to have kids. I mean, what's happening now is with all the understanding of how harmful hormones are to a woman's body, the pill wreaks havoc with a woman's body. If you're not aware of how it works, is that the pill dumps a high dosage of progesterone. So a woman has two primary hormones, estrogen and progesterone. It's called the progesterone pill. And it dumps high levels of progesterone into a woman's body. Here's what happens in a woman's body is her estrogen rises, and that causes the egg to be released. That's what causes fertilization. And then a whole bunch of other hormones get released, and estrogen goes down. In the meantime, progesterone is on the rise, and progesterone stays elevated for approximately 10 or 14 days because it's awaiting, it's anticipating the fact that a new life might have been conceived. And when the new life is conceived, it sends out hormonal signals to the body that says, I'm here, I'm here. And the body gets that signal and continues to produce progesterone through the whole pregnancy. This is why many women have miscarriages, because they have inadequate levels of progesterone. If there's not a baby there, then what happens is after those 12, 14 days, no baby, then progesterone drops off, and that's what causes a woman to have her menstrual cycle, is the fact that progesterone drops off, and that signals her body to shed the lining of her uterus. So that's what happens. The progesterone pill, what it does is it introduces progesterone through her whole cycle. Because if progesterone is elevated, then guess what? There's no rise in estrogen and there's no ovulation. There's no releasing of an egg. So basically what the birth control pill, the hormonal pill, the patch, however it's administered, makes the body think it's pregnant all the time. Do you think that's healthy for a woman's body to be pregnant? For 5 years, 6 years, 7 years in terms of its chemical composition? Do you know what a pregnant woman sometimes is like? She's a little crabby, right? She gains weight. One way you could tell that a young girl has started on the pill, her cheeks fill out. Right? Her breasts start to get bigger. These are little subtle signs that if you know, you can tell. Because that's what happens when you're pregnant. You gain weight because you're trying to nourish and sustain a baby. So this is what happens on the progesterone pill. It tricks the body into thinking it's pregnant all the time. And so as a result of this, people are non-Catholics, even, and some Catholics are saying, I don't want this. I want a green method of birth control. So they're starting to turn to natural family planning. So it's not a good motive, right? Because the motive is we don't ever want to have children. But they're using what we would consider an acceptable means. So where does the actual moral act come? I have to think about it, Joshua. It's a good question because there's a way in which their ongoing motive is already immoral because they're living in a disposition that is closed to life. Okay, but I'm not going to say that makes every single act that they do immoral, but kind of like the context, we were talking about the context already, right, is very, very, very concupiscent. And so, I don't know. Ask a moral theologian that when you get a chance. It's a great question. Thank you. All right, wonderful. Great, I love it. Thank you. Let's go on. I love it when I'm asked questions that I can't necessarily answer, because it makes me think as well.
For the disposition itself is already sort of continual.
Yes, yes, it is. I mean, again, think about what vice is. Right? It's a habit.
Right.
Which is why virtue is also a habit. You know, so vice is like a continual disposition away from God's plan. This is why I like John Paul II's language of closes, what does concupiscence do? Closes the heart to the other. Right? This is closing the, taking the pill is closing your heart to God's design, to God's plan, to relationship with God. All right, wonderful. Let's go on. Let's look at, yes, Raphael.
So just to clarify,
Please.
I think this will be quick. So at the beginning we said, how do you distinguish between something that for many would be obviously contraceptive, like abortion, versus something that many would say is preventative, like the pill. So, but we're able to put them in the same category of
They're both.
illicit because of the motive.
No, they're both in the same category of illicit because their intention is to prevent procreation. Their intention is to prevent the natural order of the conjugal act from happening. Right? And one does it by being contraceptive, meaning it prevents the union of egg and sperm, and another does it by being abortifacient. This is the other problem with the progesterone pill. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you, Raphael. Is that what happened is they discovered early and ongoing in the formula of the pill that if it was a high dose of progesterone, women got sick. And it had really bad, what do we call it? Effects. What do we call it? Side effects. Thank you. So they started to lower the dose of progesterone. Well, what happens when progesterone tapers off? Right, her menstrual cycle starts. So what one mechanism that the pill uses is sometimes it doesn't suppress ovulation because the dose is lower. So it's possible for a little baby to be a wee person to be conceived. But another effect of the pill is the lining of a woman's uterus needs to be very rich and thick. And that's part of the job of estrogen, is it starts to enrich and bring blood and make the lining of the uterus thicker. But you don't have any progesterone, hardly, going on. Estrogen, sorry, you only have progesterone. So that means the lining of a woman's uterus who's on hormonal contraception is thin. So you've got this little person, conception usually occurs in the fallopian tubes, and then the child makes its way down and has to embed in the lining of the uterus. But if the lining of the uterus is thin, what's going to happen? The little child can't embed, and you have what some people call a microabortion. Right. I mean, I like that language because it distinguishes it from like a surgical abortion. So a microabortion, meaning the child is aborted. So that's one of the mechanisms of the pill. It's you can see it's insidious in the way that it works. So it's really important. I mean, we never want anyone that we love, or even if we don't love them, to be on the pill. So some people say, well, you need to be on it for medical reasons. First of all, I would say there are very few cases where there's not an alternative. If for some reason, if you're married and you're on it for medical reasons, then what would you need to do? You would need to abstain during the fertile time if you're on hormonal contraception, because you want to make sure that you don't have a microabortion. But like, whoever talks about this, huh? So, okay, you can use it medicinally, therapeutically, that's the word. You can use the pill therapeutically, but you need to be abstaining during the fertile time. Or, try to be identifying that fertile time, which is a little bit harder on the pill, so that you don't trigger a microabortion. Okay, that was your question, right?
Thank you.
Okay, yes. You can see, we need lots of time on this one, isn't it? Because this is the reality. Yes, Luis?
I understand that there's also a pill or a drug that can, if a woman who's not on that pill suspects an unwanted pregnancy, that she can take it and then, I believe it kills the sperm. I'm just wondering if you understand you can call it Plan B.
Okay, Plan B. So I think if I understand, Plan B is where, again, that if I understand correctly, because this is not my area of expertise, so I should just say that, right? That we hear about the morning after pill, and what that does is what it tries to do is that, again, if a child has been conceived, it tries to go in and I think prevent implantation from occurring. So again, it tries to create a microabortion by preventing implantation. And now there's the reversal of, if a woman has taken, because it's 2 steps, you have to take something and then you have to wait. Boy, you're making me realize I need to, make sure I understand. Because I have friends who know all this, so if I need to know anything, I just call them. So that you take it and then you have to wait a day or 2 and then take a second dose. And that there's actually the morning after pill now reversal. That you can actually take something after you've taken that first dose and it will neutralize it. And there have been a number of babies that have been born who were saved through that methodology. So again, that's very important to know, because you might get a frantic call from a woman. I took the morning after pill, I took Plan B, but I really, really want this baby, what do I do? So you need to know, who you can send her to reverse that process. So you can see with our technology, oh my gosh, we've made it so complicated, haven't we? All right, let's go on. So Gaudium et Spes 51. These, meaning the objective standards based on the nature of the human person and his acts, preserve the full sense of mutual self-giving and human procreation in the context of true love. Beautiful. Full sense of mutual self-giving. Who does that sound like? Sounds like John Paul II, doesn't it? This is my first question when I get to heaven. John Paul II, how much of Gaudium et Spes did you write? Is GS24 from you? Or from someone else? I mean, that's what I want to know, because there's so much of it that sounds like him. And we know he was part of that committee. Such a goal cannot be achieved unless the virtue of conjugal chastity is sincerely practiced. Relying on these methods, sons of the church may not undertake methods of birth control which are found blameworthy by the teaching authority of the church. That was as strong of a statement as they made. They didn't go into the specifics. So, as a Catholic, we may not undertake methods of family planning that the church has condemned. But they didn't go into the details of what are those methods that we cannot embrace. This is where we have to see how Humanae Vitae, right, its purpose was to pick up where Gaudium et Spes left off. A lot of people accuse Humanae Vitae of being like a right hook that came out of nowhere. Not at all. You can see it is part of this development of doctrine that begins with Casti Connubii. In number 10, Paul VI wrote, "In the task of transmitting life, therefore, they are not free," meaning husband and wife, "to proceed completely at will, as if they could determine in a wholly autonomous way the honest path to follow." Okay, again, he's reminding us of this. You can't just make whatever choice you want and say it's morally correct. You have to have a good motive and a good means. So there is so much of Gaudium et Spes in Humanae Vitae. So that actually, the principal document he's drawing from is Gaudium et Spes. So I've heard people say, well, Humanae Vitae is not official church teaching. You know, like Paul VI, when he said it's not official church teaching. Well, you read it, and he's drawing from Gaudium et Spes. It's not like he's making it up. But they must conform their activity to the creative intention of God expressed in the very nature of marriage. We're back to ontology. What is the nature of marriage and of its acts, and manifested by the constant teaching of the church? So again, this is what the church has always taught. And we have to look at the nature of marriage to understand the morality of the conjugal act. The two central principles or pillars, I like to think of them, of Humanae Vitae or Humanae Vitae 11 and 12. So let's look at those. Humanae Vitae 11, calling human beings back to the observance of the norms of the natural law, as interpreted by her constant doctrine. The Church teaches that each and every marriage act must remain through itself open to the transmission of life. Why does Paul VI use this particular language? Because the Birth Control Commission submitted to Paul VI something called the Majority Report, which is what the majority of the Birth Control Committee members signed. This is the way committees work. They draft a document, and then they vote on it, and that's what gets submitted. And so the majority of the committee, signed off on what's called the Majority Report. In the Majority Report, the language it uses is it says that each and every act of marital intercourse does not need to be open to life. What counts is only that there is a general openness to life over the course of the marriage. So that's why he uses this very specific language of each and every marriage act, because he's counteracting directly what the recommendation, in quotes, of the majority opinion was, the Majority Report. So that every act, in other words, you can't close intentionally some acts to life and leave other acts open and say, look, of course we're pro-life. We've had 6 kids. Okay, well, you had 6 kids by the time you were 35, and then, the man had a vasectomy. That's not following the principle. So that's why this principle is important, each and every. And then Humanae Vitae number 12, this is what is most often quoted. That teaching, often set forth by the magisterium. Do you hear how the church documents are making the effort over and over again to say this has been the clear, constant teaching? By the magisterium is founded upon the inseparable connection, willed by God and unable to be broken by man on his own initiative, between the two meanings, or the two significations is another way, of the conjugal act, the unitive meaning and the procreative meaning. So if you'll turn your page, this leads to what is called the inseparability principle. So because Paul VI says that there's an inseparable connection. So inseparability principle. What are the two meanings of the conjugal act? Unitive meaning and the procreative meaning. John Paul II calls this the inner truth of the conjugal language of the body. The inner truth of the conjugal language of the body has both a unitive dimension and a procreative dimension. What we can say is that by God's design and not the church's invention, have you ever had someone say to you, when is the church going to change your teaching on birth control? And what's the answer? Never. Why? Because it's not her teaching. Just like if God gives you the gift of marriage and gives you the gift of children, those children are not your possession. You are stewards of those children. So too, the church is a steward of what God has revealed, which is that in the conjugal act, these two meanings, these two dimensions are inseparable. They always go together. So by God's design, there is an unbreakable connection between the two meanings of the marital embrace. So I have a very dear friend in Buffalo, New York, and here's what she came up with to help us understand the inseparability principle. So I have a pair of salad tongs here. If I have just a fork, do I have a pair of salad tongs? No, I just have a big fork that I can poke Richard with, right? If I have just a big spoon, do I have salad tongs? No, I just have a big spoon that I can bonk Kevin over the head with. It's only when I put the two together that I get the one new reality of salad tongues. This helps us understand this unitive principle of the unitive and the procreative dimensions of the conjugal act. If I have just the unitive dimension of the conjugal act, do I have the fullness of the conjugal act and conjugal love? No. If I have just the procreative dimension, do I have the fullness of conjugal love and the conjugal act? No. It's only when I have the two together in their inseparability, the unitive and the procreative dimension, that I have the fullness of conjugal love. So how can we have the unitive dimension intentionally of the conjugal act without the procreative? Yeah, any form of birth control, any form of sterilization that's intentional, right? Intentional in the sense of we're interfering, we're impeding procreation, or even withdrawal. Right? That's attempting the unitive without the procreative. But please tell me, how do we have the procreative dimension without the unitive? Right, in vitro fertilization. So you could see the church is very consistent in her teaching. So when you have something like two men attempting to have sex, what dimensions are present? The unitive and or the procreative? Neither.
An attempted.
Pardon me?
I said there's an attempt.
There's an attempt. Okay, so I'll share with you how I respond. This is why this is important. This is why this part is so long, because there's just some real practicalities that we have to have, like knowing how the pill works. So here's the way I like to, here's some distinctions that I find very helpful to make. Sorry, I'll come back up here because of the other microphone. Some distinctions I find helpful to make. Our cultures say that two men have sex. Is that true? No. So right up front, kindly introduce the distinction. Actually, two men don't have sex. Two men can't enter into the one flesh union. What two men engage in is sexual activity. So it's very important. Make the distinction between one flesh. That's why I like that phrase. One flesh union, and if you have to, and sexual activity. Same thing, two women. What they engage in is sexual activity. They don't enter into one flesh union. Well, what's the problem with that? This responds to what you said. It's very difficult to speak about these things publicly. Because frankly, they're kind of gross. And what I find frustrating is that the other side can say all kinds of things and often mean and vile things about us. And if we try to say something, we are slammed. So whoever talks publicly about what a man and a man do in their sexual activity, almost no one. Because it's not very pleasant. So okay, by now you know I'm a thinker. Right? And I think, how can I language it? So here's what I've come up with. And I always apologize, okay? I'm going to speak about something that's not very pleasant, but it's just helpful for us to know. Where a man enters a woman in the act of intercourse, that place where the man enters in the woman is designed to expand and receive. That's its design. But the place where a man tries to enter a man is designed to constrict and expel. We can see right there. It's not natural. It's not the way the bodies are meant to go together. They don't go together. And then sometimes I will say, in the act of intercourse, afterwards the man abides, rests in the woman's body. That can never happen between a man and man, because it's made to constrict and expel. It can never happen between a woman and a woman. So I just find that offering that explanation after you make the distinction between sexual intercourse, one flesh union, and sexual activity is very helpful. So I hope that's helpful. Right? These are the kinds of things that we need to figure out how to speak about publicly in a way that's respectful. So that's what I found helpful. So let's see. So we were looking at our salad tongs. So this is what I like to call one reality, two dimensions, right? We're back to one reality, two dimensions. The one reality is conjugal love. That's the one reality. And the two dimensions are what? The unitive and procreative, or I like to use the phrase life-giving. The unitive and procreative life-giving dimension of conjugal love. That's what conjugal love is. Conjugal love is meant to unite. Oh, I erased them. They're still up here, right? Conjugal love, the supernatural conjugal bond, the invisible reality is made visible in the one flesh union. Conjugal love is meant to unite. That's why you're not just going to be in a spiritual union with your wife if God calls you to marriage. So conjugal love is, its nature is to unite and to give life. That's its nature. This is the way God designed human embodied love to be expressed. It's all about the body. So that's why I try to come back to the structure of the body as much as possible. Here's how a friend of mine said it once: what God has joined, right? Man must not divide. God, in his way of creating the human person and conjugal love, has joined the unitive and the procreative, the unitive and the life-giving. Why do I use life-giving? Because I think it's important for couples who are past the age of childbearing to realize that their conjugal act, the conjugal act, is still very valid. It's not just for the sake of children. It's for the sake of deepening the unitive power of the body. And it is, remember, divinizing. So even if a couple is infertile, because it's a capital S sacrament, because they're communicating God's divine life and love to each other through the sacramental matter of the one flesh union, that conjugal act can be life-giving, even if it's not able to be humanly procreative. That is very healing for people who are infertile or past the years of fertility to hear. Because especially if they've heard over and over and over again, right? The purpose of sex is for procreation, right? The meaning of sex, the meaning of the marital union is to procreate. It's only part of the story. Unitive. That's actually the first fruit. The first fruit of marriage is the unitive dimension, the supernatural conjugal bond, and the communication of divine life and love. So living out the sacramental sign. There are 3 questions, I alluded to it in the last talk, that prepare bride and groom to enter into an indissoluble bond of covenant love. Here are the 3 questions. They might sound a little bit different to you because at least in the United States they've been revised in like the last 6 months. And so they're a little different than what we've heard in the past. So first of all, so the church wants to make sure that the bride and groom are absolutely informed as to what they are entering into. Have you come here to enter into marriage without coercion, freely and wholeheartedly? In other words, do you promise to give yourselves to each other freely? That's what goes in the first blank. Secondly, are you prepared as you follow the path of marriage? I like this because it's telling you this is a journey. Are you prepared as you follow the path of marriage to love and honor each other for as long as you both shall live? In other words, do you promise to give yourselves to each other faithfully? And third, are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and bring them up according to the law of Christ and His church? In other words, are you prepared to give yourselves to each other? How? Fruitfully. So are you prepared to give yourselves to each other freely, faithfully, fruitfully? That all equals what? Totally. So that's why I love this. It's a perfect summation of how husband and wife, what they have promised to each other, to give themselves to each other freely, faithfully, fruitfully, totally. So here's what we can say. Marital union says with the language of the body. John Paul II says we have to reread the language of the body. Marital union says with the body what was said at the altar. Right at the altar they said, I give myself to you freely, faithfully, fruitfully. I give myself to you totally. Here's what and then they say that with their bodies. Here's what John Paul II says in 118, number 4. In fact, as man and woman live in marriage until death, in some sense they continuously repropose the sign they themselves gave through the liturgy of the sacrament on the day of their wedding. What is the sign that they themselves gave? I will give myself to you totally, right? Freely, faithfully, fruitfully, totally. Please circle the word continuously. I want to contrast that to the word intermittent. Have any of you ever used the intermittent, setting on your windshield wipers? Voop, voop, voop. All right? What John Paul II is reminding us and the church is telling us is that's not what you promised to each other at your wedding night. I give myself to you freely, faithfully, fruitfully. Now I don't. Whoop, now I do. Whoop, now I don't. Whoop, now I do. Now I don't. That would be intermittent. He's saying it's continuous. Right? I give myself to you freely, faithfully, fruitfully, totally. I give myself to you freely, faithfully, fruitfully, totally. I give myself to you freely, faithfully, fruitfully, totally. You could make that into a Gregorian chant. It'd be lovely. You see, this is the difference. The majority opinion said it was fine to make that gift of self intermittently. And Paul VI and John Paul II are saying no. It must be continuous, so that whenever you enter into the marital act, you are giving yourself freely, faithfully, fruitfully, totally. So we have to reread the liturgical language of the body, even in the bedroom. We started looking at this in the last panel. In my observation, people think we go into the bedroom, shut the door, and we leave God out. Is that true? No, it's impossible, because where does the Holy Spirit dwell? In you, in your body, as in a temple, better yet, as in a tabernacle. Do you see how great the prayer between Tobias and Sarah is? Is it recognizes, most people think the bedroom is the last place to encounter God. And guess what? They should encounter God profoundly in the bedroom. Why? Because conjugal life in some sense is liturgy. They are called to live the liturgical language of the body in the bedroom, in that sacred act of total self-offering to each other and up to God, and receiving it back and being a channel of divine life and love to each other. John Paul II says, Audience 118, number 4, precisely in this moment, in the conjugal union, so rich in meaning, it is also particularly important that the language of the body be reread in truth. Here's the way I like to describe it. The language of the body, when the two become one in total self-giving, reveals the meaning and value of marital union. Look, it's not imposed. All we have to do is look at the human act. What is right there? It shows us what's the lived experience. To unite husband and wife in one flesh communion of persons and make them capable, if God so desires in that moment, of generating new life. We're not imposing anything. We're just reading and articulating what's there. So the moral norm of Humanae Vitae, and therefore of conjugal chastity, is not imposed from the outside, but it's part of the natural structure of who we are as embodied masculine and feminine persons, made to give and what else? Receive in total self-giving love that always has the potential for more, right? That we person. W-E-E. Always the potential for more. Actually, it works great in French, right? What's we in French? Yeah. So you can have a double meaning. It's fabulous. It's fun to cross over languages. What a lot of people don't realize is that when you use contraception and sterilization with the intention of depriving conjugal love and the conjugal act of its life-giving properties is not only are you refraining from making a total gift to your spouse, what about your spouse? You're preventing your spouse from receiving the totality of your gift. I mean, that's really offensive, don't you think? Saying to your spouse, I'm not going to let you receive me totally. So we often don't think about that other element, that you won't allow me to receive you totally. So that's why this reciprocal giving and receiving is woven throughout theology of the body. So what's the whole, let's see. Okay, let's look at John Paul II's contribution to the development of marriage and conjugal love and theology of the body. Before we do that, would you just stand up and stretch for a moment, please? So let's head for the finish line. We're looking at John Paul II's contribution to the development of marriage and conjugal love and theology of the body. Because up to this point, we've been looking at the history. Casti connubii, gaudium et spes, Humanae Vitae. Now John Paul, that's what he does in this first part of panel 6, is he goes through some of this history. So John Paul II develops the meaning of the body and personal self-gift as essential to the nature of conjugal love and the conjugal act, and therefore makes the embodied person central, rather than the ends of marriage or the two meanings of the conjugal act. So again, he's looking at who the human person is. Ontology precedes morality, because it's the human person who is entering into, who is expressing conjugal love and entering into the conjugal act. It's often said that Paul VI's argument in Humanae Vitae is a natural law argument. It's true, but it's profound, his argument. But John Paul II offers a personalistic defense. So what is the whole truth? Because that's what John Paul II is after all the time, the full truth of the human person, the whole truth, rather than only just a partial view or only half the story. So here's the way I would describe it. What's the whole truth of who we are as human persons? God in his very being, again, these are my words, is both unitive and fruitful. He's one. But God is also three. We can describe that oneness as unitive. We can describe the threeness as fruitful. Father, Son pour themselves out in total gift, and that total gift overflows. The fruit of their total self-giving love is the Holy Spirit. As human persons made in the image and likeness of God, we're created to be both unitive and fruitful. This is the way we image a Trinitarian God. We're created to be both unitive and life-giving. Thus, marital union as the expression of the whole truth of who we are as masculine and feminine persons is designed by God to be both unitive and fruitful, both life-giving. So to go back to this, what we can say is in the marital act, the husband pours himself out in a total gift of love to his wife. The wife pours herself out in a total gift of love to the husband, and their total self-giving overflows in fruitful, life-giving love. And if God so desires, it can be a person, right? So we can see we have an image of the Trinity right there in the marital act. They are two that become one to become three. It's beautifully Trinitarian. Audience 123, number 6. Thus, in such a case, when the conjugal act is deprived of its inner truth, because it is deprived artificially of its procreative capacity, it also ceases to be an act of love. You know what I say to that statement? Ouch. Very bluntly, he's saying an intentionally sterilized act of intercourse, whether it's by contraception or sterilization, is no longer an act of love. Whoa. That's a pretty frightening statement if you think of all the people that are using contraception and have been intentionally sterilized so as to prevent procreation. Ceases to be an act of love. Wow. So again, it's not something I would suggest that you go announce from the top of Whistler, right? But he's trying to help us understand how significant this is, how harmful it is. Let's see. Dominic, would you help me for a moment? Oh, you've read my book, haven't you? Have you read Body Reveals God?
No.
Okay, great. You can come up here then. All right. Dominic, I'm in a really desperate state. You know, I know. We had a really bad real estate crash in Phoenix. And so, look at you, blink your eyes. And so I need to borrow $10,000. Would you lend me, please, $10,000? And I promise I will pay you back in 6 months. Wait, just a minute. You're no longer a seminarian, okay? You're a very wealthy businessman from Hong Kong, okay? Would you lend me $10,000, please?
Yash.
Great, thank you. Let's shake on it, but before we do that, would you close your eyes just for a moment? Okay. Okay, you can open your eyes. Great. Let's shake on it.
I don't feel comfortable with this deal anymore.
You don't have that option.
Okay.
Okay. Good. Thank you. I promise I will pay you back in 6 months. Do you know what I'm doing behind my back?
Probably nothing good.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm crossing my fingers. This is the best way I know to image a contraceptive act of intercourse. Right? My mouth is saying one thing. I love you, honey. My body is saying something else. I'm canceling out what I'm saying by the language of my body. Thank you so much. I'll expect a check in the mail.
Okay.
Right? This is what John Paul II means by the inner truth of the conjugal act. And this, I could say all the words I want, but this is canceling it out. Audience 123.7. If this truth is lacking, one can speak neither of the truth of the reciprocal gift of self, nor the reciprocal acceptance of oneself by the person. That's where, wow, it's so impactful, the fact that, okay, I'm not giving myself fully and I can't receive the other fully. Such a violation of the inner order of conjugal communion persons, and whenever you hear communion persons, what's the R word you should think of? Reciprocal, giving and receiving. A communion that plunges its roots into the very order of the person. What would be another word for very order of the person? Ontology, excellent. Constitutes the essential evil of the contraceptive act. The issue that the Birth Control Commission had to face is contraception essentially evil? That's what they had to decide. Because if something is evil, is essentially evil, then that means it is always evil. It's always disordered. For no reason or purpose can it ever be permissible. Give me an example of another act that is intrinsically evil. Always. Abortion. Good. What else? Murder. What else? Rape. Pornography. So you could see there are other instances of acts that are essentially evil. What does the church teach? Is contraception essentially evil? Yes. That's why each and every act must remain in and of itself, open to the transmission of life. We cannot interfere and say it's a moral good. Okay, the second dimension of the whole truth of who we are, okay, this is what I was hoping we'd have time to get to. It's the distinction between human agency and technological agency. Audience 123, number 1. So we're at the bottom of page 6.5. The problem lies in maintaining an adequate relationship between that which is defined as domination of the forces of nature and self-mastery, which is indispensable for the human person. So you can see there, he's making reference to Humanae Vitae, where Paul VI says, okay, man has been given domination over the forces of nature, but also we have to exercise self-mastery. Because one of the arguments in the majority report is that, look, this is how we exercise our rationality, is that we order nature which is irrational. Nature doesn't have a proper order to it. And so we order it through our intellect. And so that's why usage of the pill and other contraceptive means are morally permissible, because we're just acting out of what God has given us in Genesis 1. Right? Placed us in dominion over nature. That was part of the argument.
In the same sense of like medicine, for example? Like taking the benefits of nature.
Yes, and using it, yes, for the benefit of the human person. So again, you can see, it's a tough question. Like, when is technology moral, its usage, and when is it immoral? So a very simple way of thinking of it is technology medicine is moral when it restores the human body to its original design. So this is why someone who has diabetes, you don't just say, too bad, right? We use medicine to restore their body to what is not able to produce on its own. Is abortion restoring the body to what it wasn't able to do on its own? Not at all. You can see that it is an immoral use of technology, because the principle is to restore the body to God's design. So contraception, so what I'm looking at here is replacing human agency with technological agency. What do I mean? Contraception and sterilization replace a human action with a technological action, so that the person does not have to exercise love as a strengthening power. What do I mean? When one is practicing responsible family planning, natural family planning, and they have discerned that it's prudent to not give God the invitation to send them a wee person, a child, then that means they have to abstain during the fertile time, 7 to 10 days, more or less. That means they have to exercise their human agency, right? Remember, when you don't act, are you exercising your human agency? Absolutely. You're exercising your human agency to not act. It's not passive. I have to engage my will. We call it self-mastery. And guess what? As we grow in self-mastery, we grow in human and spiritual maturity. But what happens with contraception and sterilization? I hand over my human agency to technological agency. In other words, I hand over to the pill or to sterilization and say, hey, you take care of it. You do for me what I shouldn't have to do for myself. In other words, I'm saying, you pill, let's just use the pill, right? You render the act sterile so that I don't have to exercise my human agency. I don't have to exercise self-mastery. This is the essential difference between NFP and any other form of birth control. Because it means I have to exercise my human agency. I have to exercise self-mastery instead of handing it over to contraception and say, I don't have to do anything. I can just engage in the act anytime I want. So I was trying to think of an analogy, a metaphor. So I'm going to go back to using a wheelchair example. Let's say, okay, you all know, I'm very athletic, love to move around, I'm not sedentary. Let's say Father Abbott invites me back in 2 or 3 years. So you guys, you're all still here. And I arrive in a wheelchair, and you're like, oh, Katrina, what happened? I say, oh, nothing. You're like, what? I say, no, I just decided I like better just kind of zooming around in a wheelchair. It's so much easier to use this technological agency rather than my own human agency. Wouldn't you think that's a little weird? Because what would have happened? And you say, how long have you been doing this? I say, about 2 years. So what has happened to my legs and the muscles? They have atrophied. So I'm no longer capable of using the power within me that's been given. This, I think, is a good image of what happens when a couple uses contraception or uses sterilization, right? That power to abstain, to exercise human agency and self-mastery, it atrophies. Because it's like zooming around a wheelchair. I don't have to put any effort into it. So I know this is a hard distinction to get, but it's worth really thinking about and seeing if you can come up with other examples. But I think it's really worth putting our time and our energy into. Can you see somewhat, at least, what I'm trying to say about how I'm allowing technology to do for me what I should be doing for myself? And what that does is it atrophies my moral ability, my moral strength. And the tragedy is it can spill over into other areas of the marital embrace. And you read people's testimonies about how contraception, slowly, degraded their marital relationship, and they didn't even know why. Yes, Patrick.
I'm wondering if there's this analogy, or I guess it's not an analogy, but people, if you were to say that to someone on the street, they could use the same argument with calculators or with the usage of cars.
You're thinking along the exactly right line, right? Because you can use, right, well, we use cars. We're using technological agency instead of walking everywhere.
So I
right.
guess
What's the difference? Yeah. The difference is, in this situation, it's person to person. In the other situation, it's person to object. And in Love and Responsibility, John Paul II speaks about how we always must maintain the relationship of subject to subject. It can never be subject to object. And so it means that my action impacts the other person. And so we're treating, we're lying with the language of the body, first of all. You don't lie to your calculator, do you? Or lie to your car. So it's a great question. So the distinction is in the quality of who's relating. The fact that it's subject to subject makes all the difference in the world. So let's just kind of take an intermediary step. Is there a difference between how I should relate to my dog and how I should relate to a rock? Yeah, I can kick a rock, and you're not going to say, Katrina, what are you doing? You're harming that rock. But what if I haul off and kick my dog? You'd be like, Katrina, what are you doing? Do you see? There's a difference in ontology between a rock and a dog. There's a huge difference in ontology between a rock, a dog, a calculator, a car, and a human person. Because we are persons, which means who are we most like? God. And our intersubjectivity and our ability to self-gift. So this is going to get harder and harder in our culture because we have a generation now that has been raised on technological agency. So you have to understand, this is why when you tell them using contraception, first of all, I wouldn't suggest that you say is a mortal sin or that using contraception is, intrinsically evil. I would suggest you say is harmful, is damaging to you and to your relationship. And they look at you like you have 5 heads. What do you mean? Because they've grown up in a culture of technological agency. Right? I mean, I've heard teachers tell me how resistant students are to even learning anymore. Like, why should I memorize facts and figures? I can just Google it. Do you see? It's replacing human agency, that effort. I hope the teachers here are loving what I'm saying, right? It's replacing human agency with technological agency. Do you know why you need to learn those things? Because it's the interior dimension of knowledge. You have to have certain understandings, and then you make connections. in your brain, in your mind. You synthesize. Things come to you that wouldn't come to you if you just only ever relied on Google. I tell you, the one that scares me tremendously are our GPSs. Because we have a whole generation that has no idea how to navigate. Okay, that's frightening. So we've replaced human agency. I know some of you probably fall into that category. So you can see it's all around us. That's why this is going to become increasingly harder. And why I wanted to bring it to our attention, that in a culture that for whom technological agency is the norm, it makes more than perfect sense. I mean, it's just a duh. Of course we use contraception. So this is how we have to try to understand the distinction. So as I say here on the workbook 6.6, so let's just go back through that first bullet point. Contraception and sterilization replace human action, self-mastery, that effort at abstaining, with technological agency, which renders the conjugal act sterile through hormones or through a device. So the person does not have to exercise love as a strengthening power. That's John Paul II's phrase. In other words, I don't have to exercise my human agency through self-mastery, express my love by abstaining. Can I just put a little footnote? This is why abstaining before marriage is so important. Because first of all, you're developing self-mastery. Secondly, you are communicating through the language of your body that abstinence is an act of love. Otherwise, what happens if you've never had that experience in your dating relationship and your engagement, that abstinence is an act of love, then in marriage, when for some reason you abstain, it's going to be easy to misinterpret that as a rejection, as somehow your spouse doesn't love you. So this is really important, that abstinence is an expression of love. Contraception, I like to say, and I don't think is an exaggeration, can lead to emotional and spiritual immaturity. I think we have a lot of emotionally and spiritually immature adults walking around because they've grown up with contraception. I don't know if you know, it's not uncommon for a girl, freshman in college, to go to her health clinic at her college for, let's say she has a cold or the flu, and she walks out with birth control pills. Because the health clinics think it's their responsibility to get every girl on the birth control pill so she can be safe. I mean, it's so widespread. So contraception risks developing the mentality that there's no consequence to human action. Right? I can just enter into sex whenever I want. There's no consequence. Do you see how it's forming our pattern of how we relate to the other subject as a person? Whereas natural family planning recognizes there's a very real consequence to my human action. Right? We could have a baby. And if we have discerned this is not the time to invite God to send us a baby, well, then we need to abstain. We need to exercise our human agency. So very realistic about human action and consequences. Contraception assumes that it's normal to make a partial gift of self. I think this is tragic. Just tragic. So if someone has been entering into sexual activity and sexual intercourse, as a teenager, as a young adult, let's say they get married, maybe at 30 or 32, think of all the years they've trained themselves that it's just normal to make a partial gift of self. It's normal to lie with the language of the body. It's normal to use technological agency instead of human agency. Do you see how incredibly difficult it can be for them to even hear the church's teaching? Because they already have so many layers on top of them that it's very hard to penetrate in, but we have to. We have to offer. This way, I'm trying to give you all kinds of different angles at which to come from it. You know, I've often said I need to make a Theology of the Body starter kit of visual aids, right? You need your bottle of what? Exactly, and you need to wake up at 3 a.m. thinking what? Exactly, right? And we need to know that God is a total gift of self in love. You know, these are all the things that we have to be communicating somehow, some way. So you can see here, I give that caution about how NFP, periodic abstinence, can be used as simply another way of achieving or acquiring one's family planning goals. So it's this one, right? Wrong motive, good means. It's still not a moral act. Let's look at love as a power. So remember, we looked at spousal meaning of the body, audience 51. The spousal attribute, that is, the power to express love. Love in which the human person becomes a gift, and through means of this gift, fulfills the very meaning of his being and existence. So I hope you will always keep coming back to this idea of power. So spousal meaning of the body is the power to express love. And also remember, justification by faith is what? The power of Christ living where? In you, through the Holy Spirit. So this is where we see this spiral. Audience 126, number 5. This then is the essential and fundamental power. The love planted in the heart by the Holy Spirit. Do you see he's assuming you're living redemption of the body, life in the Spirit, purity of heart. Because this is the power that allows you to live conjugal chastity. The spouses must implore God for such power and for every other divine help in prayer. Alluding back to that section on the book of Tobit and the prayer of Tobias and Sarah. They must draw grace and love from the Eucharist. They must overcome their own faults and sins in the sacrament of penance. Right? So he's recognizing this is a journey. We have to continue to be strengthened in prayer, strengthened through the Eucharist, strengthened in confession, right? When we don't live up to the high calling. Audience 127.1. Love is thus the power given to the human person to participate in the love with which God himself loves in the mystery of creation and redemption. What word jumps out at you? What is it, Raphael? What word jumps out at you? Give me a word.
I think I'm reading the wrong thing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, give me a word. Participate, exactly. You participate in Trinitarian love. You're united, the vine to the branch. That's where you're drawing your strength from. So really pray for this grace of participation, for it to increase in you. And audience 127, he says, love is by its nature, is linked with chastity. Ooh, love and chastity, interior to each other, which in turn manifests itself as self-mastery or continence, in particular as periodic continence, meaning that periodic abstinence. So it's where this understanding that abstinence is an expression of love. Okay, we're down the home stretch. He links love and chastity. So let's pursue a little bit more this link between love and chastity. Audience 128, number 1. Continence consists in the ability to master, control, and orient the sexual drives. Notice he doesn't say it consists in squashing them, repressing them, getting rid of them, suppressing them, act like they're not there. No. Mastering, control, orienting, right? Directing the sexual drives, what he called concupiscence of the flesh in panel 2A. In order to reach mastery over this drive and arousal, the personal subject must devote himself or herself to a progressive education and self-control of the will, of sentiments, of emotions. The church always says that the responsibility of parents is the procreation and education of children. It's not enough just to give life to children. They must be formed. So when does chastity formation begin in the life of a child? at about age 1.5, when free will emerges. That's when it begins. When do you think most parents think about starting to form their children in chastity? Yeah, like 15, 16. It's like, oh my gosh, we got to do something. So I have a workshop that I give to parents. Let's see. Actually, I gave it in Abbotsford a number of years ago. Have various titles for it. Let me see. Sex ed versus chastity. What every Catholic parent and grandparent needs to know. Because sex ed, oh, you know this, right? The Soji laws, right? Sex ed is not the same as chastity formation. And so most parents are panicked of the talk. Panicked. I won't ask you to raise your hands. But how many of you in your chastity and human sexuality formation, it basically consists, don't raise your hands, but basically just consisted of the talk. Or maybe for some of you, there was no talk, especially in the Hispanic community. Right? For generations, you didn't talk about it. And what chastity formation should be, the image I like to use is its building blocks. You begin very young, how? With gift of self. And you build one building block on another, so that when you get to the chalk, guess what? It's just one more building block on the structure you've already been creating. So it's there's a fabulous document. It has a very similar title to Father Quay's book, but it's called The Truth and Meaning of Human Sexuality. Again, very, very important. Almost no parents know about it. And what it is it takes theology of the body and applies it to human formation in human sexuality. It's filled with theology of the body. So again, there are these documents that we need to get in the presence of other people. Help people know. Audience 128.2. Continence is not limited to offering resistance against the concupiscence of the flesh. Like, okay, I just hold it in, I just make sure that it doesn't get out. All right, no. But through this resistance also opens itself to the deeper and more mature values that are part of the spousal need of the body. Can you see the growth in our human and Christian maturity? Our growth in, what's he talking about? He's describing this, isn't he? Our growth from our smaller capacity to make a gift of self to a much greater and bigger and more mature capacity to make a total gift of self. That's what he's speaking about here. More mature values that are part of the spousal me in the body in its femininity and masculinity, as well as to the authentic freedom of the gift in the reciprocal relations of persons. All right, I'm going to skip the next quote because I want to just briefly look at this last section, because then we need to wrap up. This is the fruits of conjugal chastity. It's the conference I think you need to sometime offer. Right, so it's the spacing of children through periodic abstinence. What are the fruits? How does that cause us to grow humanly? How does it help mature relationships? So he quotes Humanae Vitae 21. The honorable practice of regulating birth rate, in other words, practicing periodic continence, demands first of all that husband and wife acquire and possess solid convictions concerning the true values of life and of the family. Do you see how if you're using technological agency, those can just get pushed to the side? And that they strive to acquire perfect self-mastery. When I'm reading this to parents to married couples, I ask, how many of you have perfect self-mastery? Of course, no one does. Guess what? Periodic abstinence is going to help you acquire more and more self-mastery. Yet this discipline, which is proper to the purity of married couples, far from harming conjugal love. That was one of the accusations in the Birth Control Commission and in its writing, is that abstaining from conjugal relations harmed the marital relation. So you can see, Paul VI is directly responding to that. Far from harming conjugal love, rather confers on it a higher human value. It demands continual effort. He's realistic. Yet, thanks to its beneficent influence, husband and wife fully develop their personalities, being enriched with spiritual values. So it helps us to grow and develop as persons And then again, Humanae Vitae 21. Such discipline, look, listen to the fruits. Such discipline bestows upon family life fruits of serenity and peace, and facilitates the solution of other problems, favors attention to one's partner, helps spouses to drive out selfishness, the enemy of true love, and deepens their sense of responsibility. By its means, parents acquire the capacity of having a deeper and more efficacious, what does efficacious mean? It means effective, right? A deeper and more effective influence in the education of their offspring. Look at this next line. Little children and youth grow up with a just appraisal of human values and in the serene and harmonious development of their spiritual and sensitive faculties. So here's what I like to say. Okay, who would like in their marriage serenity and peace? Who would like something that would give them the solution, help them solve other problems in their marriage? Who would like it for your partner, your spouse, to give you more attention? Who would like to have selfishness, the enemy of true love, driven out of your way of relating? Who would like to deepen their sense of responsibility? Who would like to have a deeper and more impactful influence on their children? Who would like their children to grow up having an insightful understanding and appraisal of human values? And who would like their children to have a serene and harmonious development of their spiritual and their whole human faculties? Who would like that? Everyone, right? The answer is practice periodic abstinence. That's what he's saying. We need to retrieve this. This is not bad news. This is good news, but in a technological culture, it's offensive. So we need to recapture a human, Catholic, sacramental culture. Remember, theology of the body, John Paul II says the gospel is an appeal to human freedom. How are you exercising your freedom? How are you exercising your human agency? All right, final quote from Theology of the Body. Audience 123, number 5, we can hear the spiral. Man is precisely person, right? Made in the image and likeness of a Trinitarian God. Man is person precisely because he is master of himself and has dominion over himself. Indeed, inasmuch as he is master over himself, he can give himself to another. And in this dimension, the dimension of the freedom of the gift, that it is this dimension, the dimension of the freedom of the gift that becomes essential, meaning it's central and decisive for the language of the body in which man and woman express themselves reciprocally in conjugal love, free with the freedom of the gift. That's what conjugal chastity offers married couples. That's what practicing periodic abstinence offers. So again, I just want to put a little, subtext. There's another group in the church that is difficult to offer this message to. And it's a group within the church that claims that using natural family planning, periodic abstinence, is immoral. There is a group in the church because their belief, that I think is misguided, says that if you really trust God, you don't use anything. So how are you going to respond to that? That's where you need to go back to this. Because basically they're saying we don't have to learn how to abstain. We just enter into the conjugal act whenever we want or feel led, and we just leave it up to God to send us as many children as He wants. Well, that may be their personal perspective, but to make it an absolute, that it's immoral to use periodic abstinence in a responsible way, it's not in line with church teaching. And it's missing the fruits of periodic abstinence, the way that it crafts and matures our human personhood. Okay, so here we are. the ultimate freedom of the gift. It's the freedom to live the liturgical language of the body, in which husband and wife live out every day the sacramental sign they became at the altar, which is the sign of Christ's spousal love for the church and Trinitarian love. The sign through which they say to each other, "This is my body given up for you." The sign through which they give themselves to each other. How? Freely, faithfully, fruitfully, totally. And the sign through which they become a channel of God's divine life and love to each other and potentially to a new person. But this is also the vocation of every person, to live out the liturgical language of the body, to live out every day the spousal meaning of the body, this power to express love by saying with their words and their deeds, "This is my body given up for you." I mean, hopefully, I pray this is what you've experienced from me over the last 3 days, that I've lived out the spousal me and my body with you. I've lived out the liturgical language of my body with you. That I've said to you every day, "This is my body given up for you." That this brings us into what? What are those last? Into a union and communion through a sincere and fruitful and life-giving gift of self. Believe me, when I leave here, I will be sad. I will. Because I've experienced this communion of persons with you. Because I've been offering my total gift of self, and what have you been doing? You have been receiving it. Thank you so much. It means so much to a teacher, especially someone passionate like me. You know, that you sit there attentive, receiving, thinking, asking good questions, wanting to know more. Okay, so this brings us all full circle back to the big three. Who are you? You are a? Excellent. What are you created for? Union and communion of persons. How should you act? How can we fill that in? As what kind of a person? An embodied person made in the image and likeness of what kind of a God? A Trinitarian God whose ontology is what? What kind of a nature do you have? A unitive nature, right? The unitive power of your body. A unitive nature that is life-giving. That's who you are. No matter what vocation or state in life God calls you to, this is what you're called to live. Okay, so here are my final thoughts. That we have to constantly come back to a sacramental worldview where the spiritual and the material go together. Where the unitive and procreative, body and spirit, the material and God, spiritual and sexuality go together. And we have to constantly be aware of the significance of language. Because if we have language, we can think. If we can think, we can choose. If we can choose, we can love. And we can give ourselves how? Totally. In what kind of a way? A Trinitarian way. That's the goal. And that brings us back to our focusing question. So here's your final exam. What was our focusing question? What is the meaning and purpose of human embodiment? In other words, why did God create us male and female? So will you please write your final answer in that blank, those blanks. Fathers, to share your before and after.
Sure. So my before is we are created in His image and likeness to express His love and giving of self out of love for one another.
And then your final answer?
My final answer, if I can find it. So that we can participate and liturgically live in the total free gift of spousal love in union and communion with the Trinity.
Fabulous, thank you. And Lucas, if you don't mind, your initial answer?
My initial answer was because God loves diversity. And my final answer, to make a total gift of self and love and to reflect in our human nature the union and communion found in God's divine and Trinitarian nature.
Fabulous. And then finally, Solomon, if you'd be so kind.
Okay. Yeah, so at first I had for complementarity because it would be boring if we were all the same.
Right, that's why God created us male and female, yes.
And then my final answer is to fully express the true and unitive love that God has for each and every one of us by allowing us to participate in that love as total self-gifts to each other and to God.
Fabulous. It's so great to hear it again. Okay, and finally we all say, Viva the gift! Viva the gift, right? So before you head out on your apostolic work, Viva the gift! Right before you head out on mission, Viva the gift! Before you are ordained, Viva the gift! Fantastic.